The house party at Ashfield Park began as most house parties do, with rain. It arrived the same afternoon as the guests, which Lady Forsythe took as a personal affront, and which her butler managed with the particular expression of a man who has long since made his peace with the worst. Carriages came up the gravel drive in pairs, disgorging hatboxes and valets and damp spaniels, and the great entrance hall filled with the noise of people performing delight at seeing one another. Maris Ellwood arrived in the third carriage, with no maid and one trunk. She stood in the entrance hall while the butler sorted the other guests by rank and precedent, and she looked at the window. Rain ran down the glass in long diagonals. Beyond it, the park was grey and indistinct, trees dissolving into sky. She watched the water move and thought, 3 days, I can manage 3 days. It had been her cousin Harriet who pressed her into coming. Harriet, who was plump and warm and relentless in the way of people who believe that what you need is always more society, had presented the invitation as a prescription. You've been in mourning for 11 months. You've been in that house for years before that. Maris, come. So she had come, she was here, she was watching rain. Miss Ellwood. Lady Forsythe materialized at her elbow, a small, immaculate woman of 60, who moved like a chess piece, always with purpose. She took Maris's hands and pressed them. My dear, you look very well for everything you've been through. You are very kind to have me. Nonsense. You were your mother's daughter first and your father's keeper second, and you have done your duty admirably. Now you will eat well and sleep in a warm room and meet some very agreeable people. Lady Forsythe patted her hands and moved away to greet a countess. Maris turned back to the window. The other guests assembled for dinner that first evening numbered 14. Maris had been placed, she noted with mild gratitude, in the middle of the table. Not low enough to be a statement, not high enough to require performance. She was between a retired colonel who was deaf in one ear and a young widow named Mrs. Fenchurch who had opinions about Italian opera and shared them generously. Maris ate and listened and offered at intervals the appropriate responses. She was good at this. She had not lost the skill, only the habit. She was attending to Mrs. Fenchurch's account of a particularly disastrous soprano when she became aware that something had changed at the far end of the table. Not noise, the reverse. A small localized quiet, the kind that happens when a room adjusts its attention without meaning to. She looked up. He had arrived late. He was being seated now at Lady Forsythe's right, with the ease of a man who arrives late because arriving late has never once cost him anything. Tall, dark-coated, a face that was not precisely handsome but was arranged somehow to command. He said something to Lady Forsythe and she laughed and the table around them softened. Maris looked back at her plate. Do you know who that is? Mrs. Fenchurch murmured with barely concealed pleasure. I'm afraid I don't. Mrs. Fenchurch looked at her with the expression of someone receiving unexpected news. That is the Duke of Merrivale. Ah, Maris said. She reached for her wineglass. Her hand was quite steady. He very rarely comes to these things, Mrs. Fenchurch continued. Lady Forsythe must have worked a miracle, or owed him one. She glanced sidelong. He is not married, you know. I didn't know, Maris said. I find I had managed without the information. Mrs. Fenchurch laughed, uncertain whether this was wit or misanthropy. Maris did not look at the far end of the table again. The drawing-room after dinner was warmer than the dining-room. The rain had not stopped. It pressed against the long windows in gusts now, and the candles in their sconces moved in draughts. Maris found a chair near the edge of the room and occupied it with the competence of someone who has done this many times. She had a cup of tea. She watched. Across the room, the Duke of Merrivale was being attended to. Not aggressively, no one pressed in this company, but the room arranged itself around him with the subtle inevitability of water finding a channel. Lord Hartley stood at his left. Lady Forsythe's daughter, Miss Forsythe, had placed herself within conversational range and was maintaining it with admirable persistence. The Duke, for his part, said little. He listened. He responded when addressed, briefly and without obvious effort. Occasionally he smiled, and when he did, the people nearest him seemed to take it as a reward. Maris found this faintly exhausting to watch. She was looking at the window, rain still dark and streaming, when she heard footsteps cross the carpet toward her. She looked up. The Duke of Merrivale stood before her. He had a glass of something amber in his hand, and an expression of, she thought, mild inquiry. You've been watching the window, he said. I beg your pardon? Since dinner. You've looked at it 4 times. He said this without accusation, simply as an observation. I found myself curious whether it was improving. The rain? The view. Maris set down her teacup. It is not, but I find the watching useful nonetheless. He seemed to consider this. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, "May I sit?" She glanced at the empty chair beside her. "You may." He sat, he looked at the window. After a moment, "What does the watching accomplish?" "It reminds me that there is something outside the room. You find rooms confining?" "Some rooms. This one is better than most. Lady Forsythe has excellent taste." "She does," he agreed. Maris looked at him. He was closer now than across a dining table, and the arrangement of his face was less commanding at close quarters and more considered, she decided. He was listening to her, not performing listening, actually attending. She said, "You arrived late." "I did." "The roads are a preference." "A preference. There is a great deal of performance in the first hour of these things, everyone establishing what they are before anyone has had time to see it." It was not, she decided, an inaccurate observation. She also thought, this is the kind of thing men of his sort say, clever enough to sound like self-awareness. "And what are you?" she said, "having now arrived?" He looked at her with that attention. "You don't know." "I know you are the Duke of Merrivale. Mrs. Fenchurch told me at dinner. Beyond that, we haven't spoken before now." Something moved across his face. Surprise, and underneath the surprise, something that might have been interest. "Most people know rather more about me than I've told them. I've been out of society for some years. I'm afraid I missed whatever it was they learned. Would you like to know?" "Not especially," Maris said pleasantly. "I'd rather form my own conclusions." He was quiet. At the other end of the room, Miss Forsythe had noticed where he was sitting and was working hard not to show that she'd noticed. "Callum Stanhope," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she took it. "Maris Ellwood. I know, Lady Forsythe told me before dinner. A sensible woman," she said, "reads books, doesn't fuss." "High praise," Maris said, dry. "The highest from her." He settled back slightly. She was right, for what it's worth. "About the reading or the fussing?" "The sensible. You have known me 11 minutes. I have been watching you for 40. She turned back to look at him. He met her eyes without flinching, without the smirk that would have made the statement predatory. He said it the way he'd noted the rain, as simple fact. "Then you have the advantage of me." "You could remedy that," he said, "if you wished." "Perhaps," she said, and picked up her teacup. He stayed. He looked at the window, as she had, and for a moment they sat in a silence that was, she noted with some irritation, not uncomfortable. Then Mrs. Fenchurch descended on them both with renewed thoughts on the soprano, and the moment closed. She did not sleep well her first night at Ashfield. Her bed at home had a particular hollow worn into it over years of nursing, and every other mattress in England felt aggressively flat by comparison. She lay awake and listened to the rain and thought, not about the Duke, but about her father. He had been a proud man, not cruel. She had always been careful to hold on to that distinction, but proud in the particular way of men who believe the world owes them the position they were born to. When Lord Everton had called in the debt, quietly, efficiently, without malice or mercy, her father had taken it as something close to a mortal wound. The money was recovered eventually. The pride was not. She had been 19. She had watched a titled man lift a hand, not even in anger, just in the ordinary exercise of power, and she had watched her father diminish, not ruined, not destroyed, diminished, as if rank were a fire that burned in one direction only. She was not 19 anymore, she was 26, and she was not her father. The years between had not been wasted. She had run the house before the illness, kept the accounts, learned what it meant to manage, but she had spent them watching, always watching, and she was tired of the distance it required. She pressed her face into the pillow and thought, 3 days, I can manage 3 days. In the morning, the rain had stopped. The garden behind the east wing had a wall around it. Maris walked its perimeter, hands folded behind her back, watching the water drop from rose canes. She was on her second circuit when she heard the gate open. She did not turn around. "You're the only person I've encountered," the Duke said, "who can be in a garden with a wall and still find the window position." She turned. He was in the gate, boots wet to the ankle, no hat. He had evidently been out already. "There is no window," she said. "No." He looked at the wall. "But you were facing it." She had been, she realized. The habit was embarrassing, held up to the light like this. "I went out before breakfast," he said, coming into the garden. "I ride in the morning when I can." He stopped a reasonable distance from her and looked at the rose canes, old, thick, gnarled, innocent of anything resembling a flower. Lady Forsythe has been threatening to cut these back for years. Why hasn't she? They were her husband's. He planted them when they were first married. She prunes them. She cannot quite bring herself to remove them. You've been here before. Several times. He was a good man, Forsythe, died in 12. He said it without ceremony, which she found she preferred. She manages the estate herself now, does it well. I didn't know him. I was away by then. She mentioned you had been. I asked why. And she told you? She said you had family obligations. She didn't elaborate. He met her eyes. I didn't ask her to. She was trying, she noticed, to find the performance in it. The angling, the strategic warmth. She kept failing. My father was ill for 4 years. I cared for him. He died last November. I'm sorry, he said, flat and genuine. No embroidery. A wren landed on the top of the garden wall, observed them, and left. What will you do now, he asked, now that you're back? I don't know yet. This is the first party I've attended in quite some time. I've been relearning the rules. And how are you finding them? Much as I left them. She turned back toward the path. Shall we walk? I'm getting cold standing. He fell into step beside her, and they walked the garden wall twice without speaking, either very comfortable or very strange. She had not yet decided which. The morning's entertainment included a walk to the lake. The party spread out along the path, breaking into smaller conversations. Maris found herself walking with Harriet's friend, Miss Carey, until Miss Carey was claimed by an aunt, and then walked on alone. She heard him behind her, the change in footsteps, the way the path sounded different when there were 2 people on it. Lord Hartley's stories, the Duke said, drawing level with her, are always half as long the second time one has heard them. How many times have you heard this one? 3. He improves the ending each time. In the original version, the horse simply didn't jump. By now there is a countess involved and a question of hereditary title. Maris laughed before she could stop herself. It was a short laugh, caught almost, but it was real. He glanced at her sidelong, said nothing, faced forward again. The lake appeared between the trees, a long grey-silver stretch of water, very still. Maris walked to the far end of the group, where a single willow trailed its branches into the water, and stood there, looking out. Not quite the window, but close enough. He came to stand beside her after a moment. You do it even here, he said finally. Do what? Stand apart, watch. It's a habit. When you are responsible for someone else's survival, you cannot afford to be inside the room. You have to watch it, see what's coming. He was quiet for a moment. And now that you don't have that responsibility, the habit remains. It's not unpleasant. And yet you came to the party. My cousin is very persuasive. People who don't want to be somewhere don't come, regardless of persuasion. You came because part of you wanted to. You are very certain of what I want. I'm uncertain of almost everything about you, he said. That is why I keep asking. It was a precisely aimed thing to say. She recognized the aim and chose not to acknowledge it. We should rejoin the party, she said. Lady Forsythe is looking. She walked back. He followed, a half-step behind. The afternoon brought clouds and an indoor program. Maris sat in the library with a book and the company of an elderly general who had fallen asleep in the armchair opposite. She was 20 minutes in when the door opened. The Duke stood in the doorway. He looked at the sleeping general. He looked at Maris. He said very quietly, Is there room? The library had perhaps 300 books and a dozen chairs. There appears to be. He came in, went to the far shelves, spent several minutes in genuine consideration, selected a volume, and settled into the chair by the far window, the window she had been not quite looking at since entering the room. He opened his book. She returned to hers. For an hour no one spoke. The general snored softly. Rain began again outside, very light. The fire settled. Maris read 11 pages and retained perhaps 4. At last he said, without looking up, What are you reading? Wollstonecraft, The Second Vindication. Are you making a point? I brought it from home. I've been meaning to finish it for 2 years. He turned a page. After a moment, She's not wrong. No, Maris agreed, she is not. She turned a page and read nothing on it. The second day at Ashfield opened with sun. Maris came down to find her seat decided by Mrs. Fenchurch, who wanted to tell her about a concert in Bath. She ate, listened, and looked once at the window. The park was bright. An older gardener, slow and methodical, worked his way along the rose border. The roses, said a voice beside her. The Duke had taken the empty seat to her left at some point, during Mrs. Fenchurch's account of the concert's second half. He was helping himself to coffee with the air of someone who had always been there. You've noticed him too, Maris said. He's been gardener here for 30 years. His name is Thomas. He looked out the window. Lady Forsythe once told me she pays him more than she pays herself. She said it was what he was worth. Mrs. Fenchurch, mid-sentence about a tenor, paused and looked between them. Maris said, "I'm sorry." "The tenor," and Mrs. Fenchurch resumed. The Duke drank his coffee. Once, briefly, his knee was close enough to hers beneath the table that she was aware of the proximity, not contact, simply nearness, and she moved her chair an inch to the left and told herself it was for space to reach the marmalade. The morning's activity was archery. Maris had not shot in years. She was expecting to be bad at it. She was not, as it turned out, bad at it. Her first arrow struck the second ring, her second the first. By the third she was hitting consistently, the skill recalled by the hands before the mind caught up. "Papa taught me," she told Harriet. "He believed in it. He said a lady who could shoot was a lady who could think." She released center ring. She did not look toward the Duke. She was precise about this. He was 2 places to her right. She heard him shoot, the soft release, a beat, then the double thud of an arrow striking true. She still did not look. Her 6th arrow, center ring. When she turned, the Duke was looking at her with an expression she had not yet catalogued. Not admiration exactly. Reassessment. The recognition of something unexpected. She gave him a level look and handed her bow to the attendant. "What else did your father teach you?" he asked, walking toward her. "More than most men thought to. He had no sons." She paused. "He had many qualities, my father. They were simply not always the ones that proved useful to him." He heard the shade in it. He did not press. They walked back toward the edge of the lawn together, entirely unplanned and yet somehow inevitable. "There's a pleasure in hitting what you aim at," she said. "A rare enough pleasure." "Indeed," he said, looking at the targets. At luncheon, Maris was discussing Walter Scott with Mr. Ashby when she became aware of a change at the far end of the table. Lady Forsythe was speaking to the Duke. "And of course Lady Helena will be joining us for the dance," Lady Forsythe was saying. "She has been asking about you most particularly." "Has she?" the Duke said. It was not a question. "Her mother is most hopeful." "Her mother," the Duke said, "is always most hopeful." The table produced the careful laughter of people who understand they are witnessing something with layers. Maris returned to Mr. Ashby. "I think Scott sacrifices truth for readability more often than he admits." She did not look toward the other end of the table. She was aware, without looking, that the Duke's attention had come to rest on her. Lady Helena arrived that afternoon in a carriage newer and shinier than anyone else's. She was 23, fair-haired, and possessed of the particular assurance of a woman told since childhood that she is exactly what is wanted. She was not unkind. She was simply arranged. Every quality at its best angle, every conversation conducted with the peripheral awareness of who was watching. She was very clearly positioned for the Duke. This was not Maris's concern. She had spoken to the man for perhaps 4 hours total. She had made a specific point of forming no expectations. She watched Lady Helena cross the drawing room toward the Duke and told herself this was exactly as it should be. She looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon had gone gold. "She's very pretty," said Harriet beside her. "She is," Maris agreed. "Her settlements are considerable by all accounts." "I'm sure." "He doesn't look particularly—" Harriet stopped. "Harriet, I'm only observing." "Observe more quietly." "He didn't look particularly anything. He looked as he always looked, controlled, attending, faintly distant." Maris thought about archery and hitting what you aimed at. In the gallery above the main staircase, Maris looked at the portraits. Lady Forsythe had ancestors, some distinguished, all wearing the uniform expression of people who expected to be remembered. She was looking at a woman in blue silk from approximately 1740 when she heard footsteps. She did not turn. "Lady Forsythe's grandmother," said the Duke from the far end of the gallery. He was looking at the portrait beside hers, a severe man with an enormous wig. That fellow there was her husband. She was a notable botanist. He was not notable for anything in particular. Why do the unnotable ones always get the better paintings? Compensation. He came to stand beside her, looking up at the woman in blue. She published, 2 monographs on orchids, under an assumed name. Of course she did. Her husband's name, actually. He was happy to lend it. She did the work. He supplied the title. He found this an entirely reasonable arrangement. A pause. He was apparently a better man than most. "The bar," Maris said, "appears to have been low." He made a sound that was briefly a laugh. She looked at him. His profile was less arranged than she had seen it, a slight loosening. She had the impression of someone who did not often have their comments returned with the speed she returned them. "Will you dance tomorrow evening?" he asked. "I haven't decided." "You can, evidently. You have the posture for it. That is a very unusual compliment." "I don't give the usual ones. They bore me, and I imagine they bore you too." "They don't bore me. I simply don't believe them." "That's worse." She almost smiled. "Yes." He turned to look at her fully. "Dance with me tomorrow." Not a question, not a command. Something in the middle, harder to deflect. "I'll consider it," she said. "That's better than a refusal. Don't make too much of it." "I won't," he said, and she could hear that he was smiling. She kept her eyes on the woman in blue who had published under a borrowed name and thought about what it cost to need a title in order to be heard. Harriet found her that evening when she was dressing for supper. "He watches you," Harriet said, sitting on the bed, "all afternoon at archery in the drawing room. Miss Forsythe saw you go up to the gallery and saw him follow. It is being discussed rather enthusiastically, actually." Maris turned back to the mirror. She pinned the brooch at her collar, her mother's brooch, small and silver in the shape of a leaf, and adjusted it until it sat straight. "We spoke about the portraits. He asked if I would dance with him tomorrow." Harriet came to stand behind her, looking at her in the mirror. "Maris, what are you doing?" "I'm being careful." "Because of your father. He's not Lord Everton." "No," Maris said. "I know that. I also know what men of his rank are capable of without meaning to be. They don't have to be cruel. They only have to be careless." Harriet squeezed her shoulders once, briefly, and let go. Maris went to supper. After supper, in the drawing room, Lady Helena played the pianoforte with considerable skill. Clementi, then something Maris did not recognize. She played it well, her back straight, her expression arranged into the appropriate shade of absorption. The Duke watched from his position by the fireplace. His expression was perfectly courteous. Maris stood by the window. Outside the dark park a light moved, a groundsman with a lantern marking a path she couldn't see. The music ended. The room applauded. "Miss Ellwood," said Lady Forsythe at her elbow, "you are very good at windows." "I have been told," Maris said. "He has mentioned it?" Lady Forsythe did not specify who. "I have known him since he was 19. He was a difficult young man. Better now. He is not what people make of him. The reputation was partly true, then partly not, then entirely fabricated, in the way of reputations once they become useful to others." She looked at the window alongside Maris. "He has been, for some years, quite alone, not by circumstance, by attrition. People wanted a version of him. He found the version exhausting." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are the first person in some years he has watched the window with, and because you have a face that thinks things it doesn't say, and what it seems to be thinking at the moment appears to be unfair to him." Then she moved away, smooth as water, to compliment Lady Helena on the Clementi. She lay in the two-flat bed and went over it methodically. What was certain, what was likely, what was dangerous. What was certain, Callum Stanhope was not what she had expected. What was likely, that her expectations had been formed in the image of Lord Everton, in another decade when she was 19 and helpless and watching. What was dangerous? All of it. She was a woman of minor gentry, small prospects. He was a duke. The mathematics were simple and unkind. She pressed her face into the pillow. In the morning, she decided, she would be more sensible. In the morning, she came downstairs and found him at the bottom of the stairs, handing his gloves to the footman. He looked up. She looked down, a moment in which neither spoke, and the footman tactfully studied the gloves. "I'll dance with you," she said, "this evening." He said, "Good, you're good." Just that. Then he went out. She went into the breakfast room, sat down, and asked for tea. The evening of the dance arrived with the self-importance of an event anticipated all day. Lady Forsythe's ensemble, 8 musicians, generous for a private dance, had been set up in the music room. Furniture pushed to the walls, carpet rolled back, polished oak beneath. The room smelled of beeswax and the roses cut for the window-sills. The candles were lit early. The windows glowed warm against the late evening blue outside. Maris stood at one of these windows. The garden was still visible in the last of the light, the rose wall a dark line, Thomas's borders dim along the path. She watched them fade as the room behind her filled. Harriet appeared at her elbow. "You look very well. That colour is good on you." Maris was wearing her best evening dress. Deep blue, simply cut, the silver brooch at her collar. 3 years old, unfashionable, which meant she did not look like she was trying, which she preferred. "I've been enjoying Lord Hartley's arm stories," Harriet said, lowering her voice. "They are actually quite funny once you give up expecting them to end." Maris laughed. "He's here," Harriet said in a different tone. Maris did not turn. "I know. Lady Helena has already got to him. That's her prerogative." The music began. She turned. The first 2 dances she sat out and watched. Callum was on the floor for the first dance, partnered with Miss Forsythe, who looked delighted. He danced correctly, without the enthusiasm of a man who loves dancing and without the visible suffering of a man who hates it. He was doing what was required. She thought with some exasperation that he was genuinely good at the social performance of it, while seeming simultaneously not to be performing. Lord Hartley appeared before her and asked her to dance. He was exuberant and only occasionally correct in his footwork, but his sheer goodwill compensated. She found herself genuinely enjoying it in the unguarded way of things that happen before you've decided to allow them. He returned her to her position with a bow of considerable ceremony. She was still smiling when she straightened, and the Duke was standing 3 feet away. "You've remembered," he said. "I told you it would come back." "You didn't tell me anything of the sort." "I thought it at you," she said. "I assumed it would transmit." He blinked, then he laughed. Not the contained sound of a man allowing polite amusement. A real one, brief and unguarded, there and gone. "To the next one," he said. "If you like," she said. It was a country dance. The figures brought partners together and apart and together again, which was its own kind of intimacy. She had danced it many times as a girl, and her feet remembered it cleanly. The music started, they danced. The figure brought them face to face, hands taken, a turn and then apart, then together again. The dance brought her to him, and he was looking at her, and for the length of the turn, neither looked anywhere else. When the figure brought them close a second time, he said quickly under the music, "Lady Helena is watching." "I know," she said. Then they separated. Down the set, 8 bars, back together. Just a moment, hands crossed. "Her mother is watching her." "I know that too." Apart again. The music drove them down the line. At the bottom of the set, waiting to go up, she said to the middle distance, quietly, in the brief pause the figures allowed, "It would be very easy to read significance into this dance that is not there." "Is it not there?" he said, and the set moved and the music took them apart before she could answer. She did not answer. The dance ended. He led her off the floor and kept her hand on his arm a moment longer than required before releasing it. "You said you wanted accurate information," he said quietly, not looking at her. "So do I. I've been in your company for 2 days. In that time you have been honest with me in a way that is not the custom of these gatherings. I find it difficult to overstate how much that is worth to me." He paused. "I'm not looking at Lady Helena. I thought you should have accurate information about that." She said, "You have known me 2 days. I know you read Wollstonecraft and you shoot accurately, and you stand at windows and you lost your father 11 months ago, and you laugh when something is actually funny and not before. That is not nothing." Maris looked at the room. Lady Helena was across the floor, her back angled with studied casualness in their direction. Harriet was at the refreshments table, engaged in something that looked like active willpower not to look over. "This is not a conversation we should be having in the middle of a dance floor." "No, there's a terrace. Lady Forsythe leaves the door open for air." "I'm not suggesting anything improper," he said, a dryness that was both clarifying and more unsettling than the alternative. "I'm suggesting that if you wish to continue this conversation, the terrace is quieter." "And if I don't wish to continue it?" "Then I'll get you a glass of wine, and we'll talk about Scott's historical accuracy until someone else comes to claim us." She looked at Harriet, who was looking at the ceiling. "Water," she said, "not wine." The terrace was long and stone-flagged and overlooked the garden. The roses were invisible in the dark. He gave her the glass of water. She stood at the terrace rail. "This," she said after a moment, "is the situation I was warning you about. You warned me you find my company interesting. I thanked you for the information. I was not warning you on my behalf. I was warning you on yours." He looked at her. "Explain." She turned to face him. "My father was a man of minor gentry with an adequate estate and a good name. He lost money, not a fortune, but enough, to a lord who was not cruel and not dishonest, who simply did what lords do when money is owed. My father spent the last years of his life diminished, not poor, not broken, simply smaller than he had been." She kept her voice steady. "I watched it happen. I was 19. I watched a man's pride, a good man's pride, be reduced because the other party had rank, and rank meant he didn't have to care whether it hurt." He was very still. "That is not your fault. It is not your history. But I cannot look at a man of your rank and find him interesting without that coming with me, and you should know what that is." He said, "The man who called in the debt." "Lord Everton." "I know Everton, not well, but I know him, and I know he is exactly what you're describing." He paused. "I am not." "I know," she said, "or I believe you." She looked at the garden. "Belief requires time to become something more solid. I am giving it that time." Then he said, "What can I do?" The question was plain. No strategy in it. She said, "Nothing. I don't think it can be done for me. I had meant to leave tomorrow." "And now?" "And now I am uncertain." He looked at the garden with her. After a moment he turned the wineglass in his hand, a small, restless movement. The first time she had seen anything restless in him. "Stay," he said. "The party ends in 2 days regardless." "Then stay for 2 days." "This is not sensible." "No," he said, "it isn't." From inside the music had changed to something slow. Through the French doors, warm light fell in long rectangles across the stone. "I don't know what you want from this." "Yes, you do," he said. She could feel the edge of it, the direction things were moving, and the precise distance between where she was and where it was safe to be. "I haven't decided," she said. "That's not a no." "It's not a yes either." "I know. And then I can wait." She looked at him. He was looking at the garden with the expression of a man who has said what is true and is now holding it without pressing it. 2 days, she said. "I'll stay for the 2 days, and then I'll know more." He nodded once. "Then we have 2 days." She went back inside before he did. Harriet materialized at her elbow. "Not now," Maris said. "Later," she said. "I promise." She went to the window. Outside on the terrace he was still there, a dark shape against the darker garden, the wine-glass in his hand. She stood in the warm room with the music and the candles and felt for the first time in years something she recognized with difficulty as her own future. It frightened her. She was honest about that. She stood at the window anyway. The morning after the dance, the house had the atmosphere it always has in its final days. Looser, slightly melancholy, people beginning the mental calculation of departure. Harriet was in the breakfast room. The Duke was not. "He went out early," Harriet said without preamble. "I heard him on the stairs before 6. "Good morning, Harriet." "You promised me later." "Later is not breakfast." Harriet applied herself to her eggs with pointed dignity. Maris ate her toast and looked at the window. She was considering her second piece when he came in. He had been riding, coat dusty at the hem, hair slightly disordered, carrying his gloves. He came directly from the stables. He saw her. "Miss Ellwood." "Your Grace." It was the first time she had used the title. She had avoided it until now, calling him nothing or occasionally sir, in the way that sidestepped the full weight of it. She saw him register it. Something moved in his face and settled. He took a seat 2 down from her and poured coffee. "Fine morning," said the Colonel. "Very," said the Duke. "Rode far?" "To the village and back." Maris reached for the marmalade and found it had been passed to her already. She had not asked for it. She looked at him. He was reading a letter that had come in the Morning Post, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth, apparently entirely absorbed. She took the marmalade. Lady Forsythe gathered her remaining guests for a late morning walk. The group was smaller now. Lady Helena had departed that morning with her mother. Mr. Ashby told Maris about a new translation of a Roman agricultural text, which was more interesting than it sounded. She was listening to Columella's opinion on the proper distance between vines when she became aware of the Duke behind her, in conversation with Lady Forsythe, not trying to reach her side, simply present. At the far end of the East Walk, there was a stile into the field beyond. Lady Forsythe was decisive about returning. Mr. Ashby went with her. Maris sat on the stile, stone-stepped solid, with a view over stubble from last year's harvest not yet resown. The others went back. She heard footsteps stop beside her. "They've all gone in," he said. "I know." He leaned on the stile post. A rook landed in the stubble, found it unsatisfactory, and left. "Last night," he said. "Yes." "You told me something. I'd like to return the courtesy." He was looking at the field, his jaw set in the way of someone choosing words with care. "I was at 22 precisely what you'd have expected. Not Everton, but close enough in kind. There is a particular carelessness available to men of my rank that doesn't require deliberate effort. It simply happens if you let it." He stopped. "I let it for several years." "What changed?" she asked. "A specific thing, which I'll tell you if you want to know or not if you don't." "Tell me." He turned the gloves in his hands, the same restless movement as the wine glass on the terrace. A girl I had grown up alongside, the daughter of one of our neighbours, younger than me by 4 years. I had a great deal of charm at 22 and used it carelessly. Nothing happened that I should be ashamed of in the technical sense, but I gave her expectations I had no intention of meeting, and when she understood that, she was damaged by it. Not ruined, but changed. She married someone else, someone good to her, and was content, but I had made her less certain of herself than she had been before, and I knew it, and did nothing at the time because it was not convenient to. He was quiet. I was 24 when I understood what I had done. Too late to address it and too recent to forget. I changed what I could after that. Why are you telling me this? He turned to look at her. Because you told me the truth about your father. Because you said belief requires time. And because I think you are watching me the way you watch windows, waiting to see what's coming. I wanted to show you what's already there. She looked at the field. A wind moved through the stubble in a soft, unremarkable wave. It makes you more difficult, she said. More difficult than what? Than you were already. She got down from the stile. Come on, Lady Forsythe will think we've fallen in the field. They walked back in a silence that was full rather than empty, full of what had been said and what it changed. She was 3 steps from the gate when she turned. He stopped. He was close, closer than the paths and drawing rooms had permitted. She said quietly, I'm going to need more time than 2 days. It is not a refusal. I find that I trust your account of yourself. I find that I have been revising my expectations since the first evening, and that I don't resent the revision, and that both of these things alarm me considerably. I know, he said. How you keep saying that? It keeps being true. He reached past her and opened the gate. More time is not a problem. She walked through. They went in for lunch. Harriet found Maris in the walled garden with the old roses, sitting on the stone bench with her face tipped up to the sun. You look like someone who has had a conversation, Harriet said. He told me about a mistake he made when he was young. A real one. He told me because I told him about Papa. Not to excuse himself, to let me know. There's a difference. Yes, Harriet said, there is. Maris closed her eyes. The sun was warm on her face. I've been watching for so long, she said, watching instead of being in the room. The window is a very safe place, darling, Harriet said, but you can't open them from the outside. The garden smelled of old stone and turned earth and the ghost of last summer's roses. I know, she said at last. The library again that evening. She went deliberately with her book. He came 20 minutes later, made a small decision in the doorway, and came in. He went straight to the shelves, sat in his chair by the window. They read. After perhaps 30 minutes, she said, without looking up, What are you reading? Fordyce, Lady Forsythe's copy. She must have had it as a girl. Sermons to Young Women. Against my will, but it was closest. He turned a page with the expression of a man enduring something. I make of it that young women in 1766 were expected to have the inner lives of very polite furniture. She laughed, a real one, unguarded, going on a moment too long. He looked at her. The expression on his face made her stop. What? She said. Nothing. He looked back at Fordyce. I like it. You hold it back until something is actually funny. It means something. She looked at her book. She read the same sentence 4 times. I am going to go home the day after tomorrow, she said. And you will go back to Merrivale, then London for the season. I don't come to London. My father let the lease go in 15. He was quiet. I'm telling you because it seems relevant to the practicalities. He closed Fordyce with the finality of a man releasing something he never wanted. He looked at her. Miss Ellwood, may I call on you, at home when you're back? I'll write first. But I want to continue this, not from a window. Staffordshire, she said. It's rather far. I'm aware of where Staffordshire is. I know what it costs to ride there. I'm telling you I would like to call on you and asking if you would permit it. She looked at him, sitting in his chair by the window with Fordyce closed and his eyes on her and nothing else. Yes, she said, you may. He nodded, picked up the book, opened it with the expression of a man who has accomplished what he came to do and will now endure the remaining Fordyce with relative equanimity. At the end of the evening, when the candles had burned low, she stood to leave, and he stood when she stood, because that was what he did, always, with a naturalness she had stopped cataloguing and simply noted, and she passed him on the way to the door. She stopped. He was close. The room was quiet, the fire was almost out. She reached up and straightened the lapel of his coat. It did not need straightening. She did it anyway, her fingers just touching the wool, then withdrawing. Good night, she said. Good night, he said. His voice was slightly lower than usual. She walked to her room, sat on the two-flat bed and pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed. Then she laughed quietly into her palms, real, helpless, alarming to herself, and fell back onto the mattress and thought, all right then. The last morning at Ashfield came in with quiet light and bags moving in corridors. She was packed before breakfast. He was already there at the far end of the table with Lady Forsythe, talking with the ease of people who have known each other long enough to skip the first half of any conversation. She sat down. She ate. She talked to Harriet and to Mr. Ashby. Lady Forsythe pressed her hands as she had on the first day. I have enjoyed watching you remember that you are interesting. Maris felt something in her throat. I'm not sure. Hush. You are, you always were, your mother was before you. She released her. Come in the autumn, we do a shooting party, much less formal. She moved away to say goodbye to Mr. Ashby. Maris looked once at the window. Outside, the park was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, as it had perhaps been all along, the roses Thomas had tended catching morning light. She looked at it properly for the first time, not watching for what was coming, just looking. He came to find her by the door when the others were otherwise occupied. I'll write first, to ask when it's convenient. That would be good. And you'll write back. If you write a letter worth answering. He looked at her with that expression, the one she had catalogued on the first evening and still did not have a precise name for, but understood now as what it was. I'll write a letter worth answering, he said. She thought, this is the part where I could still be sensible. Then you know. Callum, she said. It was the first time she had used his name, without title or formality. She had not planned it. She saw what it did to him, not flinching, the opposite, something settling in his face. Maris, he said, don't make me wait too long for the letter. No, he said, I won't. She went out. In the carriage, she watched Ashfield Park until the trees closed over the drive and it was gone. Then she turned to face forward. When she looked at the window again, it was simply to look, at the hedgerows, the fields, the unremarkable English countryside going past, not watching for what was coming, just looking. Harriet took her hand briefly and released it, and looked at her own window, which was the kindest thing she could have done. The letter came 18 days later. Miss Ellwood, I find I have spent the better part of 3 weeks composing this letter in my head and rejecting every version of it. The versions I rejected were too long, too careful, or too honest in the wrong direction. This one is an attempt at brevity. I think about the terrace often, and the style, and Fordyce for reasons I would rather not examine too closely. I intend to be in Staffordshire in the last week of October. I do not know anyone else there. This could be resolved if you are willing to receive me. Your servant, etc. Callum Stanhope. She read it twice, then she wrote, Your Grace, the versions you rejected sound interesting. Perhaps you might send them as a supplementary document. The last week of October is convenient. I will tell the housekeeper. Miss. She sent it before she thought better of it. He came on the 28th of October. She was in the kitchen garden with her shears, cutting back the lavender, when she heard hoofbeats and stood up and looked at the gate. He came through and dismounted with the ease of someone who has ridden hard and doesn't intend to mention it. He was dusty from the road. No groom, no attendant, just himself and the horse, which he tied to the post by the garden wall. She was standing among the lavender with her working gloves, old and brown and not intended for receiving guests. You said October, she said. The 28th is October. It's the last day of it. I had a matter in Birmingham. He looked at the lavender. You've been cutting it back. It needed it. She pulled off her gloves. Come inside, Mrs. Prigg will make coffee. The parlour of Ellwood House was well proportioned, and she had reordered it since her father's death. Things moved, light let in, a Persian carpet recovered from the attic. He looked at all of it without commenting, which was precisely the right response. He took the chair by the window, her chair, the one she always chose. Mrs. Prigg brought coffee and remained audibly nearby in the passage, as she always did when Maris received callers. Maris noted this with the peripheral attention of a woman who has understood, these past weeks, what certain proprieties are for. How was Birmingham, she said. Birmingham is Birmingham. A dispute about a tenant on one of my northern properties. It's settled. He looked at the view. How are you? I'm very well. She was surprised to find it was true. The house is better. I've had time to make it mine again. You look better too than at Ashfield. You looked like someone at the edge of something carefully. And now? Less carefully. The coffee came, she poured. "Lady Helena," she said. "Her mother was watching very carefully at the dance. I want to know if there was something there I should know about." He set down his cup. "No, her mother positioned her. It is not the first time. I have made no encouragement to either of them. There is no agreement, no understanding, no history of any kind beyond the social proximity of rank." She looked at him. She was checking for the flinch. She found nothing. "Good," she said. "I am willing to take you at your word." He looked at her with that attention. "How is the rest of it?" She considered. Outside the window, his window today, the Staffordshire hills were bare and bronze. "Better," she said, "than it was." They talked for 2 hours, about the estate she was managing, a book she'd sent him a reference to in the third letter, which he had found and read, which irritated and pleased her simultaneously. About her father, not the illness, but the man, the Sunday evening readings, the terrible jokes delivered with perfect seriousness. He asked her to tell him one. When she did, he laughed genuinely, and said it was the worst joke he had heard in years, and she knew she was looking at him with an expression she should probably moderate. She did not moderate it. When he rose to leave, the afternoon had gone to dusk, she walked him to the gate. He untied the horse. He stood with the reins in his hand. "I'll come again," he said, "if you'll have me." "Right first," she said. He mounted. He looked at her from the height of the horse, a different angle, she thought, from all the house-party geometry. "Maris," he said. "Callum." He rode out. She went inside and sat in the chair by the window, her chair that he had occupied all afternoon, and sat in it for a long time. He came 3 more times before Christmas. The second visit, a day passing through to Derbyshire. He brought her a book, not ribboned or presented, simply handed to her in the hall. Letters written, during a short residence in Sweden, Norway and Denmark. Mrs. Prigg was in the kitchen. The visit was brief and entirely proper. They walked in the kitchen garden for an hour, and she showed him where the lavender would come back in the spring, and he showed no sign of finding this a dull way to spend an afternoon. The third visit in mid-November brought the first real cold. They sat by the fire in the parlour while sleet moved against the windows, Mrs. Prigg occupied with something in the kitchen, close enough to satisfy propriety, distant enough not to matter. He was telling her about a parliamentary bill affecting his northern tenants, when she said, without deciding to, "I think about the style." He stopped. "At Ashfield, you told me about the girl you had disappointed, not because it frightens me, I've decided it doesn't, but because you told me so that I could know, not to manage me. That is what honesty is supposed to cost. Something, not nothing." She looked at the fire. "My father never apologized for what he was, because I don't think he knew what it cost other people. You knew. That matters to me," he said. "Maris." She looked at him. He was sitting forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, close. The fire between them made everything warm and particular. "I have been conducting myself with a great deal of care," he said, "because you asked for time and because I understand why, and because I meant it when I said I could wait. But I want to be honest. I am not waiting because I am indifferent. I am waiting because you matter, and what you decide matters, and I would rather wait indefinitely than press and lose the thing entirely." "That is a very precisely aimed thing to say. I've had several months to compose it, since approximately the first evening at Ashfield. You told me you would rather form your own conclusions. I thought, yes, precisely." She stood up. He looked up at her, uncertain, the first time she had seen him uncertain, without the control smoothing it over. She crossed the distance between them. She was standing directly before him, and he was still sitting, and she put her hand against his face, just her palm, against his jaw, and looked at him. He stayed very still. "I have formed my conclusions," she said. He rose, careful in the way he had been careful all along, and he kissed her. It was not brief, it was not tentative. It was the kiss of something that has been building since October, and it tasted of patience and wood smoke and arrival. When they separated, she was still holding his face. Her eyes were open. "Yes," she said, "all right, yes." He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood like that for a moment, breathing, before she stepped back and he let her. She sat back down. He sat. The fire continued. The sleet moved against the window. After a moment he said, "That book, the letters, did you read it?" She laughed, pressed her hand over her mouth and laughed. "I did," she said. "She's better in the letters." He looked at her with his real face, the one behind the controlled public one, and she looked back, and it was the simplest and most frightening thing she had done in years. She was glad she had done it. There was, however, the matter of Mrs. Prigg, and the matter of what a duke kissing an unmarried gentlewoman in a private parlour meant for the logic of things. He understood this. She could see that he understood it. Nothing was said about it that evening, but it was present between them as he left, and she thought, there will now be a formal question, and soon. The situation has acquired its own gravity. She was not wrong. The fourth visit in December brought Harriet, not planned, Harriet having contrived to be passing through Staffordshire and arriving on the same afternoon as the Duke, with an expression of innocent surprise that fooled no one. "What a coincidence," said Harriet. "Yes," said Maris, "what a coincidence." Harriet shook the Duke's hand with the warmth and assessment of a woman conducting a rapid appraisal. Over dinner, Mrs. Prigg produced an excellent chicken. Harriet talked, and he answered, and Maris watched them both finding the register of each other. By dessert, Harriet was telling him about Maris at 18 attempting watercolour and achieving results she described as architecturally unsound. The Duke had also attempted watercolour at approximately the same age, with similar results. This discovery occupied them for some time. Maris looked at the window. December dark, nothing to see. She looked back at the table, the candlelight, the wine, the two people in a conversation she was not part of and did not need to be. This is what it feels like to be in the room. She had been outside a long time. 4 years of nursing, and before that the years of watching, and before that the 19-year-old at the edge of things, learning not to trust the centre. She was in the room. She picked up her wine glass and said, "The boats were the worst. I painted boats. They sank on the page." "The trees," the Duke said. "Every tree I painted looked like it was reconsidering its decision to be a tree." Harriet dissolved into laughter. Maris laughed with her, and did not look at the window again that evening. The news about the settlement came on a Tuesday in January, not from his solicitor directly, but by way of Mr. Ashby, who was in correspondence with a friend of Lord Hartley's, who had heard it in London. The intelligence reached her in a roundabout way that would have been comic in other circumstances. The substance was this: the Merrivale estate was governed in part by a private settlement drawn up by Callum's grandfather in partnership with the banking house that held a substantial portion of the Stanhope fortune in trust. The settlement's terms were particular. The capital sum, considerable by any measure, would pass to Callum's heirs in full, only if his wife was of noble birth. If he married outside the peerage, the trustees were entitled to withhold a significant portion and redirect it by the settlement's own provisions. She sat with this information for 2 days. It was not a law. It was not a question of her title. She would be Duchess of Merrivale the moment they married, as any woman would be. It was a question of money, a large sum he would lose if he chose her. His grandfather had not wanted to prevent a love match. He had simply wanted to make one expensive. She went to the window. The Staffordshire hills were white with the first proper snow of winter. She watched it, the white and the stillness, and then she wrote him a letter. "Callum, I have heard something. I believe it may be accurate, and I find I cannot wait to discuss it in person. The Merrivale settlement. I understand there is a clause regarding the trustee capital and the matter of a wife's birth. I want to know whether this is true, and if it is, I want to know what you intend. I am not asking you to resolve it in a letter, but I am asking you not to let me continue without knowing what I am walking into. Maris." His reply came in 4 days. "Maris, it is true. I have spent the better part of 4 months determining whether the trustees can be persuaded to waive the clause, and whether this can be achieved without requiring you to be anything other than what you are. It can. The settlement's own terms allow the trustees to waive the restriction by unanimous consent on grounds of sufficient cause. My solicitor believes 3 of the 4 will consent readily. The 4th is proving more particular. This is being addressed. I should have told you sooner. I was attempting to resolve it before you needed to know about it, which was, on reflection, a form of carelessness I had promised myself I was done with. I am sorry for that. I would like to come next week if you'll have me. There is something I want to ask you, and I find I don't want to do it by letter. Callum." She read it again. The snow had gone. The hills were brown again. She wrote back, "Come." He came on a Wednesday, a day early. He came through the garden gate while she was turning over the beds with Thomas, on loan from Lady Forsythe for the winter. She looked up. He was at the gate. He had ridden hard. She handed Thomas her fork and walked across. He looked at her and said without preamble, "I came early because I spent all of Wednesday thinking about what I wanted to say, and none of Thursday seemed useful when Thursday was still a day away. May I put the horse up?" "Yes," she said. "Come in." He asked her in the parlour before tea. Mrs. Prigg had barely withdrawn. He looked at her and said, "I'd like you to marry me." She looked back. "The settlement is being resolved. The rest, I want you to know the rest is not about the settlement. The rest is about the fact that I have been talking to you since October, and every conversation leaves me more certain rather than less, which I have not previously experienced, and that I am finding the days when you are not accessible significantly worse than the days when you are." She was quiet. "I'm not asking because it's logical. I'm asking because I love you and because I want to. That is the entirety of my reasoning." She thought about the first evening, the window and the rain and a stranger who asked what the watching accomplished, the style, the library, Fordyce, her name in his voice for the first time in a cold doorway in October, the long way round of years and a wrong understanding, and an inherited fear that was not hers and never quite had been. "I have some conditions," she said. He stilled. Then, "Of course you do. We live partly here, not always Merrivale. I want to keep this house." "Yes. I want to manage my own correspondence. I will not have letters read or directed." "Agreed, obviously. And I want—" She looked at the window. Brown hills, bare winter sky. She looked back at him. "I want to continue forming my own conclusions, always, even when they're wrong." He said, "I should tell you plainly. I came to love your conclusions, every single one of them." She stood up, he stood up. "Yes," she said, "then yes." He kissed her and she kissed him back. Less careful than November, more certain. And when they stopped, she kept her hands on his lapels and looked at his face and thought, this is what was outside the window, all along. They were married in April, not in London. The church at the edge of the village had 3 steps up from the lane, and a smell of damp hymn books and cold stone she associated, unexpectedly, with safety. Lady Forsythe came from Ashfield, which meant Thomas sent roses, even though they were technically still too early. They arrived the morning of the wedding in a basket, and Maris put them in the windows of the church herself. Harriet was her only attendant. Harriet cried, which was correct. The Duke of Merrivale stood at the front of the church with an expression she could read now fully, a man who had expected for some years to be known in the way of reputation, and had found, with considerable surprise and relief, that there was another kind. She walked toward him. He watched her come. At the front of the church, she took his hands and they faced each other, and she looked at him without armor, and he looked at her without performance, and the vicar said the words, and they said theirs, and it was, she thought, very simple, the simplest thing. Everything before it had been preparation for how simple it was. They spent the first weeks at Ellwood House, which she had kept, was keeping, would always keep, because she had said she would, and because it was hers. In the mornings, she managed correspondence. In the afternoons they rode. In the evenings they read, separately, and sometimes aloud. He read badly aloud, a slight monotone as if he had not done it for an audience before. She told him this. "How bad?" he said. "Not fatally, I can hear the punctuation." "That's the minimum. You're at the floor of acceptable." He looked at her. "Read on," she said. He read on. She listened because it was his voice, and by the end of the chapter she had stopped noticing. At Merrivale in June she learned the house. It was large and older than she had expected, parts from the century before, rooms added by people who needed them at the time and did not think about the floor plan. She walked it systematically, room by room, which he joined on the second day. "This one," she said, "in a room on the north side, high-ceilinged, currently storage. What is this?" It was a schoolroom. She looked at the windows. North light, good and even. Bookshelves along 2 walls, dusty. Room for a desk and then another desk. "Could be again," she said. "Yes." She looked at the window. The north garden below was overgrown. She could see where it had been formal once, the bones of it still there under the wildness. "I'd like to put that right. The garden. Whenever it became something other than a project for later." He looked at her profile. "It can be now." "Thomas says he can recommend someone." "Of course he does. Write to him." "I already have," she said. He laughed. She smiled. They went back downstairs through the old house that was beginning to be carefully hers. Their first child was born the following April, a boy named Edmund who arrived with urgency and was subsequently so peaceful the nurse was suspicious. Their second, 18 months later, was a girl, Frances, a name that seemed to know its own mind. She had her father's quality of attention and her mother's quality of watching, which in a child was simultaneously impressive and faintly alarming. Lady Forsythe, when Frances was 4 months old, took her and said, "This one will have opinions." She already has opinions, Maris said. She gets it from somewhere, said Lady Forsythe, with the look of a woman who has always known exactly where things come from. Their third child, another boy, arrived when Francis was 2 and Edmund was 3.5. He was called William, easy in a way that made everyone slightly suspicious. He slept. He ate. He regarded his older brother and sister with the serene confidence of someone who has correctly calculated that they will do all the interesting and dangerous things first. Edmund did the interesting and dangerous things first. This was a reasonable assessment. Maris did not stop standing at windows. She had thought perhaps that the habit would leave her when it was no longer necessary, when she was no longer watching for what was coming. But it stayed. It changed. When Edmund was 5, she was at the window of the schoolroom, the old north room reclaimed, bookshelves dusted, watching Thomas's recommended gardener work the north garden back into its former shape, bed by bed. "What are you looking at?" said Callum from the doorway. "The garden, come and see." He came. Below, the gardener had reached the old rose bed. The roses were there, older than anyone had realized, the root system deep and patient, just needing to be let. "They'll flower this year, do you think?" she said. He thinks so. He said the rootstock is excellent. "Like Forsythe's," she said. He looked at her. Not quite. "No," she said, "these are ours." She meant it plainly, which was how she meant most things now. He took it plainly, which was how he took most things. This was the arrangement of them, worked out over years and 3 children, and the considerable project of 2 people making a life that was actually a life and not a version of one. "Come to dinner," he said. "Edmund has a story. It is very long and involves a horse." "Is the horse involved because of Lord Hartley?" "Almost certainly." She turned from the window. She took his hand without thinking, which was the best thing about it, and they went downstairs together to the dining room, where Frances was already in her chair expressing opinions about the soup, and William was serenely eating bread, and Edmund was beginning a story about a horse that would indeed prove to be very long. She sat down. She did not look at the windows. She was in the room. In the Forsythe family letters, later collected by Lady Forsythe's niece, there is a brief entry from a visit to Merrivale in the autumn of 1823. The house is wonderfully altered, not in the walls but in the quality of it. She has made it live. He has made it lighter, somehow, than it was when he rattled about in it alone. The children are extraordinary. Frances argued with me about the relative merits of 2 poets, and was almost certainly right. Edmund is precisely like his father and does not know it, which his mother finds privately hilarious. She still stands at the windows, but she always turns back.